In here, one mistake can change your whole sentence. The sentence is still fresh when the mountains swallow the road. A convoy moves through southern Colorado, past scrubland and pale winter grass, toward a complex that sits low and hard against the horizon, like poured concrete left to set. The sky is clean, bright, almost careless. Inside the vehicles, there's no celebration, no last look back, only the slow realization that life can mean a calendar that keeps turning while everything else stops. Weeks earlier, the world watched a headline trial end and a name like a brand get stamped into history. Now, that name is being delivered to the Federal Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, built in the mid-1990s, opened in 1995. Designed for the category of prisoner the system labels as too dangerous, too connected, too uncontrollable for anywhere else. The approach feels wrong because it's so ordinary. No Gothic towers, no iron gates with legends carved into them. Just layers, fences within fences, pale buildings, and a geometry made to break the human sense of distance. From outside, it could pass as a secure industrial site until the doors begin to multiply, until every corridor becomes a narrowing funnel, until sound itself starts behaving differently. In this place, the architecture isn't just security, it's a philosophy. Remove chance, remove contact, remove the tiny, unpredictable moments that allow men to coordinate, recruit, intimidate, or inspire. Remove the world, one restriction at a time. Inside ADX, the day is less a schedule than a loop. The living space is small, controlled, built to prevent surprise. Light arrives filtered and limited. Air moves but never quite feels like outside. Meals come and go without ceremony. Conversation is not a background hum here. It's an event, a risk, a rarity. For many, the only consistent voice is their own. The prison's reputation, repeated so often it becomes a kind of shorthand, is isolation, hours stacked into years. In the public imagination, it's the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a phrase that sounds cinematic until you understand what it means in practice. You are not meant to escape the building, but you are also not meant to escape the building in your head. And ADX is not a story about one man, no matter how famous the name being processed behind its doors. This place became a destination for the people governments and institutions feared would keep operating no matter what bars were built around them. Terrorism cases, organized crime figures with reach that stretches beyond borders, men who attacked other inmates or assaulted the boundaries of control inside other prisons. ADX was built to be the final answer to a recurring question: what do you do when maximum isn't enough? But even a place like this develops its own economy, an economy of attention, of routine, of the smallest privileges that become massive when you live on scarcity. A book can feel like a window, a radio can feel like a crowd, a single extra minute outside the cell can feel like a holiday. People learn to count not days, but details, the shift of light across a wall, the sound of a distant door, the timing of footsteps that never become visible. It is a world where control is so complete that the mind starts to manufacture its own movement just to prove it still can. For years, ADX's public image was powered by its purpose: keep the worst of the worst contained. But the deeper story, the one that doesn't fit in a headline, was what prolonged isolation did to the men who were already unstable when they arrived, or who became unstable after years inside. The allegations didn't come as a sudden scandal, they accumulated the way pressure builds behind a sealed valve. In 2012, a federal class action lawsuit was filed over the treatment of mentally ill prisoners held in solitary conditions at ADX. It argued that isolation and inadequate care were pushing vulnerable people into breakdowns that were both predictable and preventable. The case took years, and while it moved through the courts, ADX kept operating with the same cold consistency. Days measured out, rules enforced, silence maintained. Then the invisible story became visible. A settlement was approved in federal court in December 2016 that required changes to mental health treatment protocols at ADX, including improved procedures and training related to recognizing and responding to mental illness. More than 100 prisoners with diagnosed mental illnesses were transferred out of ADX as a result of the case's outcomes. That number hangs in the air like a question nobody wants to answer. If over 100 people didn't belong in the most isolating prison in America, how did they end up there in the first place? And what happens to the ones who remain, men whose minds have begun to fray, but whose files still label them as too dangerous to move? Because ADX is not just a warehouse for bodies, it is a system for controlling narratives. When a person is locked away so completely that the outside world can't reliably see what he's becoming, the story can be anything: monster, mastermind, martyr, or ghost. The truth is usually quieter, a human being adapting to an environment that was designed to give him as little feedback as possible until his thoughts start echoing like footsteps in an empty hallway. In the months after the settlement, the institution's walls didn't change color, the mountains didn't move, the doors didn't become kinder. But somewhere deep inside the complex, the definition of acceptable began to shift, at least on paper. Protocols were revised, transfers were ordered, classifications were reevaluated, and in a place built to resist change, any change at all is a disturbance. By the time the newest high-profile arrival is placed into the routine, into the quiet, into the endless repeating hours, ADX is already carrying two reputations at once. One is the official story: absolute security, absolute control, a fortress built to stop the unstoppable. The other is the story written in lawsuits, medical files, and the slow accumulation of men who didn't break out, but broke down. And on a night when the lights cycle and the complex settles into its familiar hush, a sealed unit deeper inside ADX begins to take on a different meaning, not as the end, but as a boundary. A line that once crossed has less to do with punishment and more to do with what the system does when a human mind becomes the contraband it can't fully search. Because the next morning, a door that almost never opens is scheduled to open, quietly, procedurally, without announcement, and the person being moved isn't a kingpin or a terrorist or a headline name at all. It's someone the system once classified as too dangerous to be around anyone and too unstable to be left alone. And when that door finally unlocks, the place everyone thinks they know becomes something else entirely.
By the time the first week ends, the calendar stops behaving like time. In the outside world, a week has texture: weeknights, weekends, errands, weather, noise. Here, a week is a repeated sequence of the same small movements: light shifting behind a narrow window, a tray arriving with the same controlled precision, the brief opening of a slot that never becomes a doorway. ADX Florence was built to do this on purpose, to take the unpredictable parts of human contact and grind them down into something manageable. Opened in 1995, it became the federal system's answer to prisoners who were considered impossible to safely house anywhere else. The men who arrive at ADX don't arrive only with charges and sentences. They arrive with reputations that have weight, some tied to terrorism, some to organized crime, some to violence inside other institutions. Names like Ramzi Yousef and Zacarias Moussaoui sit in the public record as proof of who the place was built to contain. But the story of ADX, the one that stretches beyond the famous names, is what happens when containment becomes a lifestyle and isolation becomes a climate. Inside, a man learns the difference between silence and quiet. Silence is what you hear when there is nothing. Quiet is what you hear when something has been engineered to never let anything begin. In that engineered quiet, the smallest signals become massive: the scrape of a chair, the faint thud of a distant door, a muffled cough that could be nothing, or could be the only evidence another person still exists in the same universe. This is where the institution starts to reveal its second purpose: not just preventing escape, but preventing connection. And yet connection still happens because human beings are stubborn that way. It happens through rhythm, through the timing of footsteps, through the shared knowledge of how long it takes for a sound to travel down concrete. It happens through routine, the same moment each day when a man steps into the outdoor cage that passes for exercise and looks up at a slice of sky so blue it feels like an insult. It happens through memory, because memory becomes the only place that still has crowds. For a long time, ADX's reputation stayed simple in the public imagination, the country's hardest prison, the end of the line, the place designed to hold the worst of the worst. But reality, as it usually does, complicated that myth. The institution did not only contain men who were dangerous because they were strategic, it also contained men who were dangerous because they were unraveling. In June 2012, a federal class action lawsuit was filed by prisoners at ADX alleging chronic abuse and neglect of people with serious mental illness inside the facility. The allegation wasn't presented as a single shocking incident, it was presented as a pattern. Men who shouldn't have been held under those conditions, held there anyway and deteriorating in ways that were painfully predictable. The story spreads beyond the prison walls without needing dramatic footage. It spreads because the human mind, when left alone long enough, starts to create emergencies. A man begins to talk to someone who isn't there, not because he wants to frighten anyone, but because the brain will invent company before it accepts infinite solitude. Another man stops leaving his cell for the small allowances of movement because the process of being handled, being reduced to procedures, becomes more exhausting than stillness. There are no cinematic breakdowns, no single moment that can be pointed to as the collapse. It's smaller than that. It is erosion. As the case moved forward, year after year, ADX continued doing what it was designed to do, keeping people in place, and yet the lawsuit forced a rare thing in a place like this, an outside line being drawn through the inside routine. The settlement was approved in December 2016, and it required changes to how mental health issues were screened and handled at ADX. One of its most striking outcomes was that more than 100 prisoners diagnosed with mental illness were transferred out of the facility. In a prison built to resist change, moving more than 100 men is not a minor adjustment, it is a structural tremor. Cells are emptying, paperwork reclassifies lives, the complex absorbs the movement and returns to quiet. But the quiet doesn't feel the same because it has been interrupted by a question that refuses to go away. If ADX is the place built for control, what does it mean when control produces damage that cannot be ignored? And that question isn't only American. On the other side of the world, in Soledsk, Russia, the Black Dolphin prison holds men serving life sentences under conditions that are rigid, ritualized, and designed to erase opportunity. In reported descriptions of the regime, prisoners are kept under constant surveillance, moved in ways that prevent them from mapping the facility, and even blindfolded during transport. Control so physical, it tries to control what the mind can imagine. In the UK, the deepest form of custody isn't a single standalone Supermax like ADX, but a system inside high-security prisons, close supervision centers, small specialist units spread across several sites, designed to hold the most dangerous men in the prison system. Official inspections have described CSCs as the deepest form of custody, with a limited capacity and a population selected for serious, repeated violence inside prison. Different countries, different legal systems, different architecture, yet the same underlying logic. When institutions fear what a person can do, they reduce his world until there's nothing left to do at all. But the twist in this global pattern is simple and unsettling. When you remove almost everything, movement, touch, conversation, choice, you do not remove human nature. You concentrate it, you make it louder inside the skull, you make it search for exits that aren't made of steel. Back at ADX, after the settlement, the public-facing story becomes one of reforms and screening and improvement. In paper, the system learns. In practice, the environment remains what it has always been, an engine that runs on isolation, designed to outlast the men inside it. And still, ADX keeps receiving new arrivals because the world keeps producing people the system believes it cannot risk anywhere else. Some of those arrivals come from cases the public can name. Others come from violence behind other walls, men who became dangerous not on the street, but inside places that were supposed to contain danger.
ADX becomes not just a prison, but a final sorting mechanism. When the ordinary tools of custody fail, this is where the system sends the problem. That is why the movement of prisoners after 2016 doesn't feel like an ending, it feels like a pivot. Because as more than 100 mentally ill prisoners are transferred out, the empty cells left behind don't stay empty long. A facility like ADX is built to be used. Space is never simply space, it's potential. Potential for control, and potential for what control can become when it has room to expand again. On a cold morning, long after the settlement has been signed and filed away, a single door in a quiet unit unlocks for the first time in weeks. The cell has been vacant, sanitized, inspected, reset to neutrality, the kind of neutrality that only exists in places built to strip away personality. But when the door opens, the first thing that hits is not smell or sound. It's a detail that shouldn't be there. Not a weapon, not damage, not anything loud. A message, a set of numbers, written where the eye naturally lands, too deliberate to be accidental, too calm to be a tantrum. A sequence that looks like dates, or times, or something counting down. The kind of marking a man makes when he believes nobody will ever see it, unless he intends them to. And the most disturbing part is what the numbers suggest. Someone inside the strictest prison system on Earth wasn't just surviving the isolation, he was planning around it. And whatever he was counting toward is getting close.
The numbers don't look like graffiti when the light hits them. They look like record-keeping. A tight sequence, clean, repeated, almost careful, written where a human eye would land the moment a cell becomes new again. Not a scream against the walls, not chaos, a calendar made by someone who believed the calendar mattered more than the walls. In ADX Florence, calendars are strange objects. The facility was built in 1994 and opened on January 10, 1995, engineered to reduce life into controlled minutes in predictable movements. What people call the strictest isn't only the fencing and concrete, it's the way the place compresses existence until the smallest changes become seismic. One extra minute outside, one shift in routine, one unexpected decision that alters where a person will sleep next. And change is rare here, which is why the numbers feel like a disturbance. They appear not long after a quiet but historic shift in the prison's wider story, the long federal lawsuit challenging how seriously mentally ill men were being held under ADX's extreme conditions. The case began in June 2012. It moved slowly, like all large legal machines do, while the building kept doing what it was designed to do, holding people still. Then, in December 2016, a settlement was approved that required changes in mental health treatment protocols and training, and it resulted in the transfer of over 100 prisoners diagnosed with mental illness out of ADX. Over 100 men leaving a place built to be the end of the line is not just logistics, it is a crack in the myth. Because for decades, the mythology of the Supermax has relied on a simple promise: absolute control. The public story is that ADX exists to contain the unstoppable, terrorism convicts, organized crime figures, men deemed too dangerous or disruptive to be held anywhere else. But the settlement forces a second, quieter truth into the light. Sometimes the most dangerous thing inside a Supermax is what the environment does to a person who cannot withstand it. That is where the numbers begin to make sense. Not as an escape plan, but as a countdown to a decision made far away from the mountains. A transfer date, a review date, a deadline that would determine whether a man stays buried inside the strictest routine on Earth or is moved to a place with treatment, contact, noise, anything that resembles the ordinary world. In a place like ADX, hope is not inspirational, it is tactical. It becomes a kind of quiet obsession, because obsession is one of the few emotions that can survive in a climate of controlled nothing. So the man writes, he counts, he tracks time the way someone counts oxygen when the room is sealed. The day arrives without drama. There is no swelling music, no grand announcement, no cinematic moment where the building seems to breathe. The routine continues. Light, tray, silence. Until it doesn't. A door opens that usually stays closed. A human being exits a cell that has been his entire universe. The world does not look different. The concrete does not change color. But for the person walking out, everything has shifted. The horizon has widened by inches, and inches are enormous here. And the haunting twist is this: what happens next does not feel like a victory. Because Supermax custody isn't only an American invention, and it isn't only a building, it's an idea that keeps reproducing itself in different forms across borders. The belief that total restriction can solve problems that ordinary confinement cannot. In Russia, the Black Dolphin Prison, Penal Colony No. 6 in Soliletsk, has become infamous for extreme control and isolation, with reported routines that prevent prisoners from mapping their environment, including blindfolding during movement between buildings. In the UK, close supervision centers are described by official prison inspectors as the deepest form of custody in the country, holding some of the most dangerous men in the system, people who committed serious, often repeated violence while already imprisoned. Different structures, same logic: reduce a person's world until it can be managed. But the deeper you go into custody, the more the system runs into the same paradox. Control can contain bodies, it cannot always contain consequences. The settlement at ADX did not turn the place into something gentle. It did not change the fact that it is still a supermax, still designed around isolation and strict routine. What it changed was the narrative. It proved that even the most sealed institution can be pressured, forced to document itself, compelled to move people who were never meant to move. And that is why the numbers on the wall are unsettling. They reveal that the real weak point in the strictest prison system in the US isn't the concrete. It's time, it's paperwork, it's the outside world's ability, slow, imperfect, delayed, to reach inside. In the weeks after the transfer, the cell is scrubbed, the writing is removed, the surface returns to neutrality, as if neutrality is truth. But the pattern remains in the building's history. A supermax survives by pretending it is final. Lawsuits and settlements prove it is not. The men who remain learn this the way people learn weather, not by reading reports, but by feeling pressure shifts. They hear that people are being moved. They sense the slight change in routine. They watch the building absorb a rare kind of movement and return to stillness, as if nothing happened. But something did happen. A place built to erase people had to acknowledge in writing that certain minds were being harmed by the very design meant to control them. The strictest system in the country had to admit that there are limits, even if those limits arrive years late after damage has already been done. And the final twist, the one that lingers, is quiet enough to miss. The numbers on the wall were never a map out of the prison. They were a map back to the world. A reminder that the outside still existed, that days still passed, that decisions were still being made somewhere beyond the concrete. In ADX, that is the most dangerous thought of all. Not violence, not rage, not rebellion, but the idea that the door might open one day, and the person who steps out might not be the person who went in. Because Supermax doesn't just punish crimes, it reshapes time. And time, in the end, is the only thing even the strictest prison system can't lock down forever. If you thought this one was wild, wait for the next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the world's darkest systems start leaving fingerprints.